Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. In the news today, the United States and allies have imposed sanctions on Russia in retaliation for actions taken in the Ukraine. And President Biden has interviewed 3 Supreme Court candidates. Today's topic is whether bipartisanship is even possible in politics anymore. And we're joined by Jason Grumet, the founder and president of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Good to see you.
Ken?
In person.
Good to have some coffee.
Well, look, right off the bat, you're roughly 15 years old, BPC. How does that feel? I mean, when you created this 15 years ago, what were you expecting to be here 15 years? What were your goals, and where did you think we would be as a country versus where we are today?
So look, I think the intellectual discount rate's about 20% a year. So I never looked pretty much past like 3 or 4. Look, I would say that what I kind of imagined as an institution is pretty much what we have. I didn't imagine that the country would get a little more partisan every single day since we founded the organization, right? So I think the ecosystem we're up against now is just a lot tougher than even 15 years ago.
And what do you think's accelerated that? Is it misinformation, social media? I mean, partisanship's always existed in our country, right? And I mean,
look, right. So it's important to realize, right? The history of our country was not 240 years of class and cohesion, right? I mean, democracy's always been a battle, and I think what we believe is that it needs to be a good fight, right? So we're not non-partisan or post-partisan or meta-partisan. Like, we believe in the constructive collision of ideas between 2 parties. So why is that not happening so much? Look, there's dozens of reasons, right? Yeah. Some that I think people are well aware of in terms of just the polarization, intoxication of the constant media cycle. Obviously, the electoral incentives right now don't kind of drive people towards collaboration. What I think people don't spend as much time thinking about is just the kind of human quality of the institution. And it turns out that if you want to have a complicated conversation, if you want to actually venture a different idea, there's no one really there to support you. Right? The incentives for that are really, I think, greatly diminished. So we spend a lot of time actually just helping members spend some time together and get to know each other, because ultimately that's what's going to allow them to kind of overcome the headwinds.
So going back to the 2020 election, how much of that desire on the part of Americans to have people just work together, be able to have a relationship, played into maybe President Biden's appeal, right? The ability of him having been a senator, working across the aisle. How much of that do you think maybe Americans were?
So look, I think there certainly was a majoritarian desire for greater normalcy. And at the same time, a very significant fraction of the country just feeling so kind of alienated from the premise of opportunity and engagement that anger has certainly not gone away. I think if you look at the polling, it's totally contradictory. Yeah. Right? I think by and large, if you ask people if they want their members of Congress to be kind of rigid or collaborative, they'll say collaborative. But then when you kind of poll the question of, do you support the Republican idea or the Democratic idea, regardless of the policy, people flow one way or the other, right? So I think that fundamentally, I think the only way Congress regains the trust of the American people is to start getting more stuff done.
Yeah. How much of this is structural in the sense of voting reform issues, gerrymandering, just how our democracy is set up, right? I mean, obviously in the election that we just had, a lot of that was led to the insurrection, led to challenges of integrity of the democracy at its core. I mean, how much of this is structural?
Well, look, I mean, a lot of it is structural, which doesn't mean that it cannot be changed. I mean, members of Congress, in my experience, are basically pretty good people with really bad incentives. Yeah. They're making rational choices against, I think, the desire to be reelected in an environment where if you don't have that many people voting in primaries, it just drives you towards the edges. But again, there's this kind of desire to howl at the moon and say we want a constitutional convention or we want to change the media. That's just not going to happen, right? And the good news that people don't pay enough attention to is, even as bad as it is right now, Congress can still actually get some things done. And there's very little appreciation of that because the headlines all drive you in a different direction. But even right now, there's actually legislation moving forward that helps millions of people. So that's the momentum that we try to encourage.
Nice. And I saw some commentary that you had about Build Back Better, right? There was about 70 provisions in there that were truly bipartisan, but kind of lost, right? I mean, how much of this is a communications, strategy or a unified selling of,
Every time a politician or political party starts to lose, the problem is communication, right? It's never actually their strategy or their policies. It's always their failure to convince everybody else of how wonderful They truly are, right? So the Build Back Better agenda has been, both positive for policy and really pretty negative. There is there's a long-standing tradition in our country for whoever wins the election by a percent or two to announce that they have now a mandate to kind of drive the policy in a direction that is actually not consistent with the kind of median of the country. There was a desire to compare President Biden to FDR and say we should have this first 100. Well, FDR had 78 Democratic senators, right? I mean, President Biden had 50-50, and even that was a little bit of a toy toss. And so, I think the ambition of Build Back Better was just out of context with where the country really is. Now, part of what has been challenging is there are a lot of components of that agenda that we believe strongly in, that have had a lot of bipartisan support on investments in childcare, investments in paid leave, and healthcare. And because the process is designed to be partisan, essentially you alienate any Republican support for those ideas, right? So now, I think it's probable that something still moves forward, much, much smaller, but rebuilding the collaborative instincts around those policy ideas is going to take a while.
Interesting. Well, what I love about what you're doing at UBC is it's not just focused abstractly and theoretical. You have policy priorities, you have issues you're advocating for, affordable housing, et cetera. How are you coming up with what you think should be a legislative priority or an agenda? And how are you kind of trying to motivate both sides of the aisle to come together on what really should be easy policy priorities that Americans care about that we could and should possibly achieve?
Well, so the first issue is how we structure the Bipartisan Policy Center. So, we're not a think tank in the classic sense. We don't just have a whole bunch of folks independently ideating and coming out with programs and then publishing papers that say, this does not necessarily represent the view of the organization. Mm-hmm. Everything we do represents the views of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Because we're not just writing studies to make ourselves feel good, we're actually trying to have impact in the world, which means we have to take those studies with lobbyists and go to Capitol Hill and advocate for those provisions. And we can't have, different parts of the organization contradicting itself. So we have to actually create that same kind of integrated policy imagination as a political party would have to. And, our ideas come from lots of different places, right? I think that, we work to have a portfolio of issues. My view is that the middle is hardly ever the place where policy should land. There are some issues that are better center, right. There are some better center left. And so, we work on just about every significant domestic policy issue, probably with the exception of K-12 education. But on energy and climate and health policy and immigration, I think, those are kind of core ideas. We do a lot of work on just how do you get the democracy to work better. And here, in each one of those places, there is a bipartisan opportunity today to move the ball forward. Not a comprehensive solution, but just to climate change. We're not coming up with a carbon tax anytime soon, but there's a lot of support for accelerating the innovative technology that we've got to get to scale really fast. On immigration, we're not going to figure out anytime soon a real answer that addresses the 13 million undocumented folks in this country. But there is movement around the legal immigration system. And if you have a good legal immigration system, then you have less challenges. So with illegal immigration, and so with almost every issue, there is a space. And democracies, it's a momentum sport.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And we're entering a strange part of the calendar, right? I mean, primaries in congressional districts, midterms coming up. How is this a period to get anything done? I mean, are you optimistic, pessimistic? Is it you just
so
these next few months are crazy?
Awkward silver lining is that we're basically in a permanent campaign.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Right. So in the good old days, you would have this true inflection point where 4 or 5, 6 months out, you move from governing to campaigning. It's always hard. Now, does it get harder in those final 4 or 6 months? Yeah, sure it does. But I think that there is certainly room in every 2-year cycle to have an 18-month conversation. Yeah. And there's 5 or 6 months left.
Interesting. Talk a little bit about the aggression we're seeing in DC. Elected officials around the country, getting death threats. I mean, it just seems like a more aggressive time, kind of fueled by social media and misinformation. I mean, what do you think of just the general climate today and how that impacts potentially other people stepping up and putting themselves forward for public office? I mean, the type of people who are running for office, I mean, it seems to be a pretty high disincentive for anybody to run if they're worried about, their personal integrity, their safety. Yeah.
Right, look, so the underlying insight, right? Participatory democracy requires participation. And there are not a lot of folks anymore saying, I want to grow up to be president, right? I mean, there's a broader desire just to kind of shut out what is perceived to be just have coffee with Ken. There's been a lot of, I think, percolating anger in this country for years. And certainly as you see just big changes in our economy and kind of swaths of the country feeling left behind, I mean, that's very real. President Trump weaponized that anger, right? I mean, I think the premise of President Trump's political engagement is to motivate a group of people to feel like they are in fact being left behind. I mean, there's a lot of politics of grievance that animated his presidency. Not to say that the grievance wasn't real, but just about every president that I'm ever aware of at least claims that they're trying to connect the country. Right? Some are better at it than others, but they all walk in to say, Senate President Biden, I want to support the people who voted for me and the people who don't, and not red enough. And like, President, you just didn't go for that, right? He's like, you're my friends, you're not. And that, I think, just obviously, increased the tenor. How we get it back? It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to require actually addressing the misfortune and the root stuff, right? I mean, President Trump was an expression of that. He didn't cause that kind of.
And some of those root causes tie directly to interpersonal relationships, right? I mean, Bob Dole was one of the founders, passed away at the end of last year, spoke highly of the relationships he created, the friendships over time across the aisle. How important is that? I mean, the kind of origin story of BPC with Bob Dole and some of the other leaders who founded it. How do you try to continue to tell that story? And is it even possible for Democrats or Republicans to have a personal relationship, to go on these trips together? I mean, COVID's probably made it even harder because of a lack of ability to be in person for such a long period of time.
All good insight. So look, no question that whether it's politics or business or marriage or playing in a jazz band, personal connection is the fundament of how one solves problems. The idea that could be true every place but Congress, I think doesn't acknowledge its kind of fundamental basis. But we're not a nostalgic organization, right? Like, we're not wishing that the folks had kids playing in Little League anymore. I mean, the key issue is that members of Congress don't spend time in Washington. In fact, over 100 members of the House literally sleep on couches in their office, which is kind of gross, right? I mean, I've been on those couches wondering, like, were you literally like sleeping here last night? So I think that, there's a lot, again, of the structural challenge, but a lot of them actually really enjoy each other's company. We have a program called the American Congressional Exchange, and we get Republicans and Democratic House members to spend 2 or 3 days in each other's districts and then reciprocate. And they're lovely trips. And they exchange texts. And I think when I've asked them what they get out of it, a lot of them get to send like the WTF messages across the aisle saying, like, are you guys up to? And in a small way, I think that makes a big difference.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember when I was at the Kennedy School, they would do the new members of Congress retreat. It'd be 3 days, and people were out socializing. You might find them at a bar afterwards talking about the election, and that seemed to matter so much.
And like, it's just about like anything. I think it is easy to be polarized if you are separate. It's harder to hate on somebody if you actually look at the other kids.
Yeah. So when you think about the next generation, about colleges and universities, you've been pretty vocal now about the need to kind of foster constructive disagreement, right? Like, what are you pushing? Why are you focusing colleges, universities, and what impact do you think that has moving forward?
So look, the alienation.
You have a young lady in college now, right? I'm sure you have no constructive disagreements with her, right?
So I think the alienation that we are seeing in Washington is a reflection of what's happening across the country. There's this idea that like the country's lovely, but Washington's this cesspool. No, I mean, this is in fact a reflection of the voting public. And the question is, like, how do we start to kind of reinstate this premise that you can have a constructive disagreement? The idea that if you don't figure that out in your educational experience, you're going to kind of figure it out when you get to Washington seems pretty slim. And there's been a long-standing question about the kind of quality of education and whether, in fact, one can have free expression or whether that comes at the cost of the sense of inclusion. We strongly believe that free expression, diversity, and inclusion are not exclusive to one another. And so we have a pretty significant project looking at campus free expression, working with college leadership and others, trying to make sure that there are, in fact, forums that enable that life skill.
Yeah. And another extension of that is really your commitment to fierce urgency of pragmatism.
Oh,
right?
I
just love it, right? Yeah. Because it's one of these things where you don't think it's something that fires people up, right? It's not, because you're not playing to the fringes, right? But I feel like more of the
finding ways to inspire aggression around collaboration is it's tough. But I think there's this notion that and it's kind of a long-standing premise, which is no longer true, that it's the courageous person who stands on the edges and fights against the machine. Mr. Smith, resisting the kind of inside game of Congress. The courageous folks are actually the folks who are willing to work with the machine, right? It does not take a lot of courage to hang out on the left and right and throw talking points at each other. And if you actually want to do the hard work of trying to develop a public policy that can move forward in a divided country, that's courage. And really, that's what the Bipartisan Policy Center was designed to address. I think that those members of Congress, they don't have a lot of superstructure or support behind them. Yeah. And so we try to help those folks who are trying to do the more courageous work of actually advancing public policy. Interesting.
So when organizations like yours are created, you kind of aim for maybe there will be a day we can put ourselves out of business because we have achieved bipartisanship, right? That's not happening. It's a tough climate, but at the same time, a silver lining seems to be that more people are interested in your work and more people are paying attention to it, right? So despite the chaos in Washington and the lack of bipartisanship, what are some of the positive things that your organization is seeing, and how are you benefiting, and how are you getting a larger seat at the table potentially?
So look, there's certainly kind of an asymmetry between how bad the country's doing and how important we appear. I would rather have it in the other direction. It's certainly the case that over the first decade of our work, our policy projects animated a lot of attention because people really cared about those outcomes, and everyone kind of assumed that democracy as a foundation was just kind of there to support the advancement of whatever issue, climate change or healthcare. And so we used to get patted on the head a lot, right? We had a commission on political reform, which came out with all kinds of recommendations about improving the primary process and improving the kind of rules that govern the legislative process. And everyone's like, oh, that's really sweet that you're doing that, right? But nobody actually felt like it was their obligation to invest in that. And that has changed, right? I think that leading up to, but certainly following Jan 6, there's now an understanding that democracy is not guaranteed, and it is material to the interests of everybody. So there's a lot more interest coming from corporations and others to actually invest political capital in making the system work better. And so that is fulfilling and energizing for the Bipartisan Policy Center, but it's not a great statement on where the country is.
So let's extend on that a little bit, right? Part of what we love talking about is this nexus between public and private sector and social impact at large. What new role are you seeing as you approach year 15 on the part of the private sector and their involvement? I mean, it's the newest actor at the table on a lot of things post George Floyd, with the coronavirus, with everything going on. Private sector and corporate leaders seem to be stepping up. How are you seeing that? How are you trying to capitalize on that, bring them into the fold, and get them excited about pragmatic approach to actually
look, one just kind of framework reality is that politics is inherently a short-term engagement. Every 2 years, a member of Congress has to kind of reappeal to the voting public. That leads to just some really dumb stuff, like questioning whether we should pay our sovereign debt, for example. Companies have an inherently longer-term interest, which leads to a more practical point of view, because what companies and the Bipartisan Policy Center believe in is durable public policy. So that has given kind of corporate America a different role. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next several months, because while corporate America has been very supportive of a lot of issues that were included in the big reconciliation package, they very aggressively have opposed and seemingly successfully opposed that package because of the tax cuts. But the question now is, what do they do to kind of rehabilitate their support for childcare and working on issues around healthcare and paid leave, which they do support, but they appear to have opposed. So I think that there's a real test now for corporate America about whether they double down and try to advance those policy issues while they feel no longer, I think, vulnerable to the tax increases.
And outside of even fundraising, tie it back to relationships, right? Like, what can the private sector do to incentivize bipartisanship?
So, interesting again, like the, insurrection was a crystallizing moment for, a lot of folks. It didn't tell us anything we didn't know, but it kind of threw it in everybody's face in a way that was very uncomfortable. You saw a lot of companies initially kind of hold back their political giving. A lot of companies said that they were pausing on their PAC giving or in different ways, stepping back. Our view is that PAC giving is some of, frankly, the best money in American politics. Yeah. It is transparent. It is not purely partisan. It is advancing a policy interest as opposed to just a, we win, you lose. So I think what we're seeing happen now is that you're seeing a number of companies start to prioritize members of Congress who are just competent and collaborative, not just focused on their own policy issues. So starting to see some incentives, going to folks who worked on the select committee to improve the democracy, not just people who happen to be in your district supporting your particular interests. I think that does start to matter.
How do you maintain a level of optimism coming to work every single day?
Well, so first of all, we haven't been to work for a little while, but we are coming back.
I assume you're still working.
We're all 10 hours a day in our basements. But one of the things that really is kind of encouraging about this place is the people are great and have really strongly different points of view, right? They're like, half the folks in this country are Republican, roughly half are Democrats. That reflects, across the DPC staff. But we all come together every day to try to make the country succeed. And that's actually kind of exhilarating. And then also, if you pay attention to the details, important things are moving forward, right? There's legislation reforming the Electoral Count Act, which would matter a lot. There's legislation on China competitiveness, which is moving forward. Congress just passed a bill to, make it no longer the case that in case of sexual harassment, you have to have mediation, so that universities can't just basically say, go off in a little room, you can't sue us. So there's it's not comprehensive immigration reform, but it's not insignificant.
Yeah. So looking back at this time of your life running BPC, what were some of the proudest moments you had?
Many of the proudest moments are not kind of visible to others, which reflects the nuance of our imagination. So one of the most important things that we've done recently was to help restore the practice that used to be called earmarks. It's now called direct congressional giving, or better, community-based projects. Because this is a real way to strengthen the democracy, right? If we don't let members of Congress do anything that reflects who they are and anything that's popular, we can't expect them to do anything that's unpopular. We've had a significant impact along the way on dozens of different laws. We really spent a big, amount of political capital helping the Congress move forwards on the American Cures Act, which sped up the FDA process, which has actually been important in the current moment of terrifying pandemic. We've had a lot of impact on advancing clean tech energy technology. There was a bill passed toward the end of last Congress with Senators Murkowski and Manchin working together that brought 30 different pieces of legislation together that actually will make a real difference if we're going to try to address the climate problem in time. We've done work kind of helping to restore and extend the children's health insurance program. So there's again just lots of things where our team's been able to develop ideas, but then actually go to Congress and help them move forward.
Nice. As we close out, individuals, organizations, companies, what can they do to get more involved and help you with your mission and kind of have a seat at the table to actually make an impact? A lot of individuals I know or companies, they're not into the individual political giving, but they do care about the country, democracy, and how we kind of move forward and kind of get back to some normalcy and have some actual achievements on policy issues. How can they help?
Also, most importantly, democracy is not a sure thing. I think in particular, the kind of challenge over the legitimacy of elections is the weak spot.
Yeah.
When we think about the strength of democracy, people tend to talk about the estates, right? The executive branch, Congress, the judiciary, even the media. We're the fifth estate, right? I think one of the most important, powerful ballast and resiliency in our democracy are people who care about democracy. And there are lots of different ways to get involved, whether it's at the local level, bringing coherence to school boards, or checking out our website and looking for ways that people can get involved. There are lots of different ways for individuals to actually make a real contribution, not just financially, but an actual contribution intellectually and politically to the work we do. And we certainly welcome more of that.
Well, look, thanks for making the time and hosting us today.
I've hardly had a chance to drink any of this delicious coffee.
I know. Well, look, I want to thank Jason for being here. I want to thank you for tuning in. Our next Coffee with Ken will be March 15th with Dr. Sam Gado, former NFL star turned doctor. Register for that and watch past sessions at www.coffeewithken.com. Until then, enjoy your coffee.